Back in January, I released a video on the channel on the archetype of the prophet, which was mostly a scholarly piece on Max Weber's account of the prophet's role in history. But as I was talking about in the channel update, after some reflection, I wasn't really happy with that video. It's a topic that I was so passionate about in researching and learning about, and I just don't think that showed up in the video. What I found so compelling about it just seems to be absent from it. I wanted to right that wrong with this video, and I want to tell you why I think it matters. Why I find the idea of the prophet so intoxicating for what I want to do with this channel. And more than that, how I think we should conduct ourselves in these ages of culture wars and social media outrage porn. It also makes sense of classic personalities like Socrates, Marx, Nietzsche and Jung, and 21st century characters like Trump, Zizek and Peterson. The element of the prophet archetype that hits so heavy for me isn't actually from Weber's account, which adds a lot of rich historical detail, but the Franciscan priest Richard Rohr's tagline for the prophet as being at the edge of the inside. Firstly, let's clarify what we mean by prophets and by the edge of the inside. Obviously, when we speak about prophets normally, we think about the Old Testament and characters like Jeremiah, Ezekiel and Isaiah, or we think about Muhammad in the Islamic tradition. The historical Jesus fits pretty neatly into this category as well, but the transformation of that doomsday prophet into 1/3 of the Godhead muddies the waters somewhat, so we'll set him aside. But what Weber and Rohr are trying to get at is the je ne sais quoi that connects all these figures. They try and get at the essence of the prophet. And that is where the edge of the inside comes in, because that is where the prophet comes from. The best way to understand the prophet is to compare him to the priest. In the ancient Jewish religion, the priest had that nice temple up on the hill at the center of Jerusalem, and that was the center of the religion and of the kingdom. And like in ancient Egypt, that religion had a lot of political clout. The problem with this is the problem with all power structures. It's a straitjacket. It develops its own culture, and the incentives and vying interests end up steering the ship rather than the value system that built the ship in the first place. In the same way that all politicians have to compromise on the way to power, the priest has to compromise on his journey to become priest. You don't become high priest unless you've learned how to play the game of politics. This inevitably takes us away from the voice crying in the wilderness, from the desert, from the burning bush that speaks to us. This all fits well with William Blake's words in Auguries of Innocence that God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. The priest very much dwells in the realms of day. He's living a life of service and duty and has to navigate the kings and scholars and common people as part of his work. The prophet, by comparison, is more like a wild animal. They come in scraggly and manic from the edges, and they bring some primal truth with them. They aren't constrained by any power structures. They are, by their very nature, powerless. They are rebel voices calling from the wilderness. And yet, there is such certainty and power in their voice that they can shake an entire society. Now obviously, the prophet isn't totally wild, and that is where the edge of the inside comes in. The prophet is one of us. They are an insider. The prophet was trained by the system, honed by it, and then, somehow, they went into exile. In Weber's account, this is akin to the refusal of the call stage of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, where the hero is called on the adventure and says no to it. The hero, or in this case the chosen prophet, doesn't want it. They aren't willing martyrs, but unwilling participants ripped from their regular lives. So the point that I really want to stress here is that the prophet was one of us. They were born into tradition, they were classically educated, they loved their parents, they listened in class, and they had good hearts. But that didn't take them anywhere, or maybe that's the very reason they didn't get anywhere. They weren't willing to corrupt themselves and play the games of power when they could hear the voice of the burning bush. And this is how the prophet ends up at the edge of the inside. Note that they aren't outsiders. They're not atheists criticizing religious beliefs as nonsensical and logically incoherent. They're part of the same tradition, the same culture and society. They're on the inside, but just barely. They're at the very edges. It is from these edges that they can find their voice. The rest of us are drowning in the chorus, uncertain where the other voices begin and ours ends. But at the edges, these marginals, as Victor Turner called them, have one ear on the inside and one ear on the outside. And that is how they can hear a new harmony. Before we look at examples of the prophetic idea, I want to talk to you a little bit about Patreon. For those of you who haven't seen the recent channel update, I've had a bit of a change in relationship with YouTube. I've come to see the limitations of YouTube for making the impact in the world that I'm looking for. And now I only see it as part of the difference. In ancient times, there was a distinction between exoteric and esoteric philosophy. Plato's dialogues, for example, were exoteric. They were meant for consumption by the mass audience, and that entailed certain simplifications for those exoteric teachings. The esoteric teachings, on the other hand, were for those inside in the school, and that meant they could go a lot deeper. Sure, I can make some map over here with the edge of the inside, but the point is I've realized the importance of a layer deeper than YouTube, a community layer where we are talking as a group and refining and figuring things out together. And Patreon is that layer. Regular viewers will know there's been a Living Philosophy Patreon for a while, but this year has had a lot of challenging soul searching, and the upshot of that is a new emphasis on Patreon. So the Q&As are now live streams and a whole lot of fun, and we've got a book club at the moment where we're currently in the midst of reading Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, and there's more Patreon specific content like the review where I look at what I've been reading, watching or listening to lately. There's long form interviews with experts and other creators, the most recent being with the amazing Damien Walter from the Science Fiction with Damien Walter YouTube channel, and much more. So if that sounds like something you want to be part of and you believe in figuring out what's going on in the world and how to move beyond polarities and crises, then head over to Patreon to join the community and support the channel. That concludes this public service announcement. Karl Marx is a great example of the archetypal prophet. He fits the mold in almost every respect. Marx came from a good family, had a good education and good prospects. His wife was the daughter of a wealthy baron. But despite his father being a lawyer with vineyards and property and providing for Marx's university education, it just didn't work out like the bourgeois love story it was supposed to be. Instead, Marx spent most of his life in a state of humiliating poverty. Karl and Jenny lost 3 of their kids in large part due to the conditions they were living in. When new visitors would come over, Karl would send Jenny to the pawn shop with everything that wasn't nailed down just so they could entertain them. There were constant debts and unpaid bills, and if it wasn't for the support of Engels and the handouts from other socialists on the continent, Marx couldn't have survived. In the case of Marx, it wasn't a voice from a burning bush that called him on his quest, but something in his own soul that became possessed. He studied at the University of Berlin a few years after the death of the great master Hegel, at a time when the great philosopher's fame was at its peak. In Hegel, Marx found his religious fervour and taking the work of Hegel in a new direction, away from spirit towards materialism. He prophesied the end of capitalism and the rise of communism. It was this religious conviction that sustained him through the decades of poverty while he was writing his great work, Das Kapital. He did everything he could to help this transformation along and dedicated his life and lived in expectation of a soon-to-come societal transformation. One scholar has found no less than 40 predictions of impending revolution between Marx and Engels in those years of exile. Marx was an insider. He was from an upper middle class family, he was married into a great family, he could write, he was a genius.
My boy's wicked smart.
And he had a heart that dreamed of a better world and a tyrannical temperament to match. With this set of traits, Marx could have been an incredibly successful man. But instead of reaping the fruits of his intelligence and background, he became capitalism's most famous critic. He could speak so well about the corruption of the system because he was an insider. He was from inside the system. raised in it, and trained inside it. He could have done very well, but that wasn't how things played out. He was a prophet in every meaning of the word. You can see similar elements of the prophet archetype in the likes of Nietzsche, an ex-academic, ex-German, writing his cryptic aphorisms and oracular Zarathustrian passages from his exile in the heart of the Swiss Alps. You can see it in Jordan Peterson, with his doomsday prophecies of the postmodern neo-Marxists trying to destroy Western culture from the inside, and of the infamous Orwellian Bill C-16, which, as we all know, has eliminated all freedom in Canada and the world. Prophets aren't always accurate, their passionate intensity tends to bridge the gap. Another great example is the father of critical race theory, Derrick Bell, who is a prominent civil rights lawyer who saw that civil rights wasn't going to change things, and so ended up criticizing the movement from the edge of the inside. And his prophetic impact can be seen in the way of the classical biblical prophet as steering the civil rights movement towards a more systemic critical approach with critical race theory. Trump also fits in the mold. Keep the edge of the inside in mind as you watch Dave Chappelle talking about Trump on SNL.
That first debate, I'd never seen anything like it. I've never seen a white male billionaire screaming at the top of his lungs, "This whole system is rigged." I know the system is rigged because I use it.
Trump is a sort of insider turned prophet who risked all his business and his comfortable life to do his part to make America great again and to drain the swamp of Washington, which was destroying the country. Contrapoints has a similar arc at the start of her channel. Before starting Contrapoints, she was a big part of the atheist YouTube subculture. And then, with the early Contrapoints videos, she's attacking the anti-woke bastions of that community. In some of those earlier videos, she described herself as a former edgelord character. Given the power of this position at the edge of the inside we've been discussing, it should surprise us little that Contrapoints is the leftist YouTuber who has managed to speak most to those flirting with the alt-right, earning her the strange nickname of the alt-right whisperer. She, after all, can speak as a former insider of that sort of culture. There is a sense in which she is kin to them, not a complete outsider, but certainly not an insider either. So you can probably start to see what's so important about this idea of the edge of the inside. If you're going to argue with a scientist, you won't get far citing postmodern deconstructive readings. If you're going to criticize a religious fundamentalist, you don't cite scientific evidence falsifying their position. By the same token, if you're going to argue with a 4chan edgelord, then the moralizing discourse of the left probably isn't going to get you very far. The most powerful way to speak to someone is in their own language. You can use the language of an outsider, but you won't make an ounce of an impression on your audience, though you may consolidate and galvanize your own base. And the thing is, only insiders can speak the language. Those who are speaking the language as outsiders are very easily spotted. Maybe it's a lack of credentials, maybe it's something cringy like someone doing an outsider's imitation of an insider.
I'm Prison Mike!
These caricatures are not convincing. They're recognised for what they are and dismissed or mocked accordingly. I watched Good Will Hunting last week, hence this second reference to the movie in one video, but if you remember in the movie, the difference between the therapists that Will goes to see. The first ones are pretentious, elitist, bourgeois therapists.
No more shenanigans, no more tomfoolery, no more ballyhoo.
They're easily mocked and taken apart by this working class genius. But the therapist who does actually gel with him is someone from the same rough neighbourhood who gets his experience, and yet moves in a different world now, and is able to criticise the worldview from the edge of the inside.
Not your fault.
Think of Peterson's language of the postmodern neo-Marxists, which we looked at in the video on Peterson's shadow. If you listen to the way he talks about Marx, or about Foucault or Derrida, it's painfully obvious that he doesn't know the first thing about them. Everything he knows comes from Stephen Hicks's book explaining postmodernism.
I want to recommend a book first to everyone here. It's called Explaining Postmodernism, and it's by a gentleman named Stephen Hicks.
Which is a tour de force in bad scholarship, as Jonas Saka showed in his video analysis. Peterson is a Michael Scott among leftists. He is clearly an outsider working with a caricature. He has no understanding of their worldview. He has only demonic caricatures of their thought leaders.
Foucault in particular, who never fit in anywhere and who was an outcast in many ways and a bitter one and a suicidal one his entire life, did everything he possibly could with his staggering IQ to figure out every treacherous way possible to undermine the structure that wouldn't accept him in all his peculiarity.
So, do you think he has even the slightest chance of convincing a leftist who knows anything about postmodernism or about the Frankfurt School? To anyone who knows the first thing about these traditions, Peterson's words are the most ignorant nails on the chalkboard of knowledge. What Peterson's words do, though, is galvanize his base and ignite a passion and fury in them. He's still prophetic, only he's not at the edge of the insight of leftism, but at the edge of the insight of Western culture. Raised and educated and an academic, but a critic of what Western culture has become and of what academia has done to the world. This is the insight that he is at the edge of. And so for me, this edge of the insight idea is really powerful and it just landed really heavily. It's exactly what I've been aspiring to do with the channel. And as I was talking about in the previous episode on the removal of the Pomo petition video, I've been hooked on Jordan Peterson's 2005 article, Peacemaking Among Higher Order Primates. And in that article, he makes a distinction between what he calls local victories, which are basically zero-sum, where one side triumphs over the other, and transcendental victories, where both sides come together into a new higher synthesis. The symbol of the transcendental is the bridge. To get to a transcendental victory, we need a Venn diagram where the edges of the insight overlap, where Petersonians and leftists can speak to each other. I think Contrapoints, especially in her earlier videos, does a great job of that, and I would say reduces polarity through understanding both sides. There's a power in the idea of the edge of the insight to me because it speaks to a possibility for hope. If we can find the edges where the insights overlap, then we can possibly build a bridge between polarities. You're never going to get everyone on board, but I think we can create meaningful bridges across ideological chasms with this attitude in mind. And from there, there's a possibility for these bridge makers to spread understanding through their bubbles as prophetic figures. The key idea that goes along with the edge of the insight is the idea that we mustn't judge groups by the worst of their members. It's the faith that if a group of sane humans believe in a thinker or an idea, there's something in there that we can learn. We will never agree with everything they say or believe, but we can get inside their perspective enough to understand how they got there, and with that, we can begin to build bridges. That, at least, is what I see in the archetype of the prophet. The outsider who isn't corrupted by the power of the temple, whether that's academia, capitalism, or Western culture. And so we are free to see the world in new ways, in ways that can renew what is crooked and broken. So that's everything for this episode of The Living Philosophy. If you're intrigued by the idea of the prophet and you want to learn more, I'd recommend checking out the earlier video that goes into more detail on the prophet archetype by clicking here. I'd like to thank David Pilabosian, Ibiso Feissa, and all the other patrons for their support of the channel. As ever, if you have any thoughts, insights, or feedback, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.